everyone, a very warm welcome to you. I am Katsina and I'll be taking you on the newspaper segment. First, we'll start with the Daily Independent. Boldly written, Jonathan assures PDP of support ahead of 2027 election. Party says it doubts independence of INEC. 2027, call for me to step aside, betrayal of Nigerian people. Article, you find that on page 29. Ekiti, 2026, there won't be election without Oluyede Igba ones. You find that on page 7. Tinubu names Odusoti first female Director General of Nigerian Law School. You find that on page 29. Northern Group warn Wike conduct threat to democratic governance. You find that on page 6. Nigerians 100 trillion market cap. At the top of the newspaper, you find this score generates 5,725 billion, remit 381,029 billion to electricity market. Lassa fever claimed 206 lives as Nigerian record 1,119 cases. Moving ahead to the Guardian newspaper, boldly written, Nigerian fuel crude importation concern defies price war. You find that on page 6. At the top of the newspaper, 2027, I will step down for no one, article vows. You find that on page 3. Over 140 million Nigerians may become poorer by December. You find that on page 2. U.S. operation in Venezuela undermined international law. You find that on page 2. Poor interagency cooperation may stall Joshua's vehicle crash investigation. You find that on page 7. IGP order mobilization of withdrawn VIP escort, deploys DIG, 17 CPS. You find that on page 29. APC has no right to complain about Wike, says PDP. You find that on page 6. COAS pledges normalcy in polity amid calls for state policing forest guard. You find that on page 29. Resident doctors biker over negotiation begin strike on January 12. You find that on page 4. Government suspend Oyo monarch over alleged illegal mining. You find that on page 29. We'll move over to the Daily Monitor. Boldly written, no presidential aspirant will step down in ADC. Article. This court collects 570 billion naira, installed 228,614 meters in Q3 2025. You find that on page 2. Tinubu appoints Dr. Odutosi as first female Director General of Nigerian Law School. You find that on page 4. PDP leaders meet Jonathan, say he pledged support for PDP. You find that on page 2. Photojournalists, others adopted in Kaduna community. You find that on page 5. ADC slams federal government over silence on Venezuela, says lack of official position embarrassing. Moving on to the next newspaper, which is Leadership newspaper, boldly written, 2027, we won't endorse any presidential candidate, Arewa leaders. You find that on page 4. 1,119 Lassa fever cases, 206 deaths recorded in 2025. You find that on page 31. On top of the newspaper, Turaki upbeat as Jonathan meets People Democratic Party officials. You find that on page 27. 5.36 million electricity customers remain unmetered, says regulator. You find that on page 26. Resident doctors pick holes in federal government's claim, insist on January 12 strike. You find that on page 16. Defection, not betrayal. Shegaru defends Governor Yusuf. False Kwankwaso's stands. You find that on page 8. Tinubu appoints first female Director General of Nigerian Law School. You find that on page 7. Nigerian to clash with Algeria in AFCON quarter-final match. You find that on page 39. Moving on to the next newspaper, which is the Liberty newspaper. Boldly written, 2017. I will step down for no one, Atiku vows. On top of the newspaper, IGP redeployed DIG, 17 CPS nationwide. Turaki led PDP, NWC holds closed-door meeting with Jonathan. FRCN Kaduna collapse threaten North Legacy Institution, Professor Ango. Katsina, several persons adopted as bandits attack communities. NNPC appoints Governor Yusuf as national leader after suspension. Electricity, over 5 million Nigerians still unmetered, NERC. We move over to the next newspaper, which is the Daily Trust. Boldly written, Katsina, killings, kidnappings return. You find that on page 3. On top of the newspaper, PDP alive, strong Jonathan. You find that on page 4. 141 million Nigerians will be in poverty in 2026. PwC recommend food supply reforms. Others, you find that on page 20. We'll move over to the next newspaper, Daily Sun. Boldly written, terrorist plants explosives in Niger farms. Others, you find that on page 6. On top of the newspaper, 2027, no aspirants will step down in ADC presidential primary. Article, you find out on page 26. Military bust suspected suicide bombing network in Northeast. Intercept terrorist logistics supplier. You find that on page 6. Young adult hit hardest in 1,119 Lassa fever case. NCDC. You find that on page 27. CSO slam fiscal radicality in Tinubu. NASS budget repeal. You find that on page 27. Support Tinubu to sustain progress. Wike urged Rivers people. You find that on page 27. We'll move over to the next newspaper, which is This Day newspaper. Boldly written, Jonathan. Despite many defections to ruling APC, PDP alive and strong. Party blasts APC over Wike on Rivers crisis, says it can't cry foul now. On top of the newspaper, troops arrest 8 terrorists linked to Gamburu market mosque suicide bombing. You find that on page 5. We move over to the next newspaper, the Matrix newspaper. Boldly written, 2027, politically stranded, presidency mocks Obi. On top of the newspaper, ICT, construction, energy, others tipped to drive Nigerians' economic growth in 2026. You find that on page 3. We'll move over to the next newspaper, which is the Punch newspaper. Boldly written, electricity subsidy nears 2 trillion naira yearly. You find that on page 9 and 20. On top of the newspaper, ADC ticket, Atiku rejects call to step down, blast Tinubu. You find that on page 3. IG deploy newly promoted DIG, 17 CPS. You find that on page 3. Recapitalization hurdle. Pension firms hunts for 277 billion naira lifeline. You find that on page 21. VIP protection crisis. NSCDC moves to recruit 30,000 officers. You find that on page 2. 2027, Jonathan pledged active role in PDP, says Turaki. You find that on page 22. Ekiti pool. Opposition parties threaten Boy Scouts over PDP exclusion. You find that on page 22. 3 siblings burned to death for burial. January 14. You find that on page 4. Banditry. Police free 6 vigilantes arrested by army. You find that on page 4 and 5. We've come to the end of this segment. Thank you so much for watching. Till I come your way again.